I'm going to do now, if I can, is just come back to some of these slides that I put up earlier. This is a bit of an overview of the structure of the COTS work that's being done within NEST, and it's a summary of that original strategy. So you can see we've had presentations this morning that detail the effectiveness of the program, of the control operations at an individual site. We've talked about how you distribute effort within voyages. Carlo gave us a talk about how you identify your priority sites right across the outbreak region. And we've talked to some extent about indirect methods for controlling COTS. So Frederica talked about her predator work, identifying those predators. I talked a bit about zoning. But what I want to identify in here is that there's also been other work that hasn't been presented today that's looked at more direct approaches. So, and Russ mentioned some of these, Triton, attractants and deterrence, push-pull technologies. And Lana Hoy is also pulling together a report, sort of a discussion paper around essentially new technologies for biocontrol, gene tech and similar things. Sam talked about the eDNA technology, and something that is coming up in the next few months is that we will be pulling together a series of workshops where we want to take the great work that he and his colleagues have been doing and also the technology development work that they're doing currently with the CSIRO guys to look at how we might go about designing a surveillance program that would not only detect the presence of larvae in the water, but might actually predict when we might have outbreak conditions about to occur, so that we can have an early warning system and so we can start making sure that we've got everything in place. We'll also, in future iterations of the program, be looking at developing up models that will integrate all of the information that's been produced to date and start using those to identify what are the best objectives, the most cost-efficient, the most ecologically meaningful objectives that we should be designing or structuring the program around. And then finally, we've heard a couple of the talks from Morgan and from Frederica about specific sort of ecological projects, but I just wanted to identify that there are a range of other projects happening in this area. So there's going to be some work looking at the interaction between COTS and bleaching. Rob Beeman has been doing some work looking at the distribution and extent of deep water habitat for COTS. And how we, the implications of that for the management program, etc. So what I hope you come away with from this is that what we've got is not just a program of research that's looking at COTS, but what we've got is a strategy for how we go about managing COTS, both at a policy level and also at an operational level, and that strategy is tightly linked with the research, and that what I really hope comes across here is the research that we're doing is actually feeding directly into the operations, into those policy strategies. And we're working really closely with operators and with the Marine Park Authority to make sure that what we understand about the system is reflected in the way they go about their work. So thank you very much for sitting and listening, and we haven't had time through most of this for asking questions, so what I wanted to do now is hopefully they'll give you an opportunity to ask questions from speakers from throughout this whole session. So is there anyone who's got some burning issue they'd like to raise? And a hand has gone up right at the back there. Can't see it.
It's been great getting information on the new approaches and the data showing how well it's working. My question is about the current outbreak. There hasn't been much discussion about where things are at with the current outbreak, but my understanding is moving south and probably moving to those areas where bleaching has been less. So I suppose there's basically stuff that wasn't bleaching now that could be by Crown of Thorns Starfish. Not a great outcome. Is there much thought about it, how the new funding and the new approaches are going to be applied to deal with how the current outbreak can be limited in the southern part of the Reef?
All right. I can provide my answer, but Darren, do you want to?
You kick off.
I can kick off. So the approach that we've outlined is certainly not area specific. So the overall strategies, the whole idea was that we'd actually be able to use that, as the outbreak moves south, we'd be able to actually refine the method, because each new area is a new iteration for us, so experimentally, that's fantastic. And in terms of our discussions with Gabrumpa as well, in terms of thinking about the planning, the idea has been that the operations will shift as the outbreak shifts. So that would be my quick response. Darren, do you want to add?
Yeah, hey. Were you here for my presentation this morning?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it showed you in terms of the status of outbreaks and the threshold levels moving down off that Townsville region. In terms of where we're trying to go with these increased vessels, we're hoping to have, at the moment we're talking with the various successful persons who are tenderers, and hoping to take work orders forward for those vessels in the very near future, by the very near future, in the next month or two. Would have liked to have started on the 1st of July, but unfortunately government procurement processes are more complex than many of us understand. And so we're anticipating in the next month or two, hopefully, to get a vessel operating out of Townsville in addition to those other two vessels in terms of RRC and AMTO already operating. At the same time, we've got the outbreak in the Swains, and we've got things happening in terms of the north, in terms of north of Cooktown as well. Again, a variety of information in terms of surveillance is feeding us into that, and so hoping to get some vessels there as well. And importantly, a consideration for us also, again, is in terms of what Russell, has just presented in terms of the importance of that initiation box and us thinking about that critical, maintaining that critical level of, COTS abundance, what is it, 3 per hectare. So that's something we've got to think about in the mix. So I haven't got all the answers for you at the moment, but things are moving quickly with the new vessels and the new funding. Post end of June 2019, we've still got the continuation of some of the initial vessels operating, and then obviously we have the foundation with their funding that's coming on board in that 58 million. And at the moment, we'll be talking to the foundation about, what is the transition in terms of that new funding and how it relates to the existing program. But those discussions are yet to occur. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Any other questions? Comments?
I think probably want to say an anecdote of what we saw in the Seychelles. It's all about pest control. It's all about pest control, what we're talking about here in kites, and we did manual removal of kites in the Seychelles. But the major thing with the reefs in the Seychelles was also Drupella, and manual removal of what we were restoring. Had a massive Drupella infestation after the 2016 bleaching event. Is there any funding also potentially, if you're seeing a correlation between kites on the reef, but also there's Drupella there, because obviously the Seychelles is having a very big problem with that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we have been collecting data, or Gabrumpa has been collecting data on Drupella at the same time that they're doing the coral cover and some of their COTS estimates. So the opportunity exists for looking at that, and we have the intention of looking at it for any correlation like that. Haven't yet done it, can let you know.
Okay.
Yeah. But not just Drupella, and a whole range of other diseases.
Yeah.
And just to let you know, part of RAP is to look at how the ecosystem might be used to ensure or manipulated and able to ensure that the coral that is put out there survives well, and it does have a section that looks at what you would have to do with Drupal in exactly the situation that you've described. And it would be similar to what's being done with the Crown of Thorns, but which is not part of RAP explicitly because it's already got its own program. But so people are thinking of what you've
Manual removal.
could be manual or it could be ecological sort of things like predators and green zones or what have you.
Questions, observations, criticisms, come on. Oh, criticisms and a hand goes up straight away. Excellent. Just sitting in here.
I was talking to someone over the break about how they have a problem with Crown of Thorns in Ningaloo, and probably they have it across the Indo-Pacific. Is there something specific about the sort of social and political context here on the Barrier Reef, and it being this sort of poster boy of Australian tourism and nature, that makes the situation and move forward what it is?
Sorry, the situation,
So
the
sort
response.
of landscape of responses and what we should be doing and the sorts of things that are being suggested and not being suggested. Is there something quite specific to this context here that means that that's happening, or do you think if it was happening on another reef in a similar way?
Right. So a short answer from me, I think, would be that the Great Barrier Reef is so important economically to the state and to the country, and but also, as Cole pointed out, ecologically important, but as Cole pointed out, economically important in this particular area. But why don't we throw that question to Cole himself, sitting up the back there?
The reality, whether you like it or not, is it's simply a matter of lobbying. And we've been able to get the funding. After years and years of effort, we've managed to tie it into the Barrier Reef. The Ningaloo hasn't reported massive outbreaks of Crown of Thorns. They're not reporting significant coral loss, but we had all those situations here affecting the tourism industry and the employment that's attached to that industry. That's not to say we wouldn't look at trying to do something in Ningaloo if we had the resources, but we don't have the resources to really pull it into check right now. We're getting close. But look after our patch first, and then we'll look where someone else's.
Thank you. We haven't. Darren, did you want to say something?
Just in relation, I showed up in terms of the blueprint for the Great Barrier Reef, and COTS control was identified as one of the 4 big on-ground actions where we can contribute to coral reef resilience and live coral cover recovery. So that's an important thing too, as an identified on-the-ground action that this direct COTS control is important. Just a comment from me, someone who was actively involved in the rezoning back in 2004. Really important that we start thinking about, connection to the different levels of protection that we have with the different zoning. One of the big things that gets promoted is, particularly from the fisheries sector that I'm very familiar with, is concern over what they want to promote in terms of rotational zoning to enable, biomass of target species to recover and then go in and fish them for a short period of time, etc. Good fisheries strategy. If you want to optimise returns for different species, but in terms of from a biodiversity protection, so I think we have to be very careful of the terminology that we use. So I encourage people to think about terms in terms of a special management area, in terms of temporary protection, etc. We want green zones to be green zones and be left as green zones. So we just got to be careful in the terminology that we use to promote any forms of temporary protection. Thank you.
That's a really good point, and a learning from this whole experience has been that terminology is fundamentally important, and I think we've tripped over a couple of times on that. We've managed to recover, haven't we, Mary? But it's sorting out your terminology when you're talking to such diverse groups is really important.
Us managers are not perfect either, don't worry.
Yeah, right. Well, looking forward, As I've identified a couple of times in this morning, I really see that and Russ also pointed to this, I think the major obstacle in the future is not whether we can control Crown of Thorns starfish, but it's really, can we maintain the support for management of Crown of Thorns starfish. Irrespective of the technology that we're going to use into the future, we will need to have ongoing support. And so I think if we value the reef, we really have to figure out ways to ensure that we're not sort of with this stop-and-go approach to funding of the research, but more critically of the actual on-ground work. How we do that beyond making sure that Cole Mackenzie and colleagues are, doing extensive and constant lobbying, I don't know. And I think, we all have to play a role in that, but I think that's going to be the challenge into the future for us. Russ, you want to comment?
Yeah, well, thanks. And really on that point, I guess, well, we do have some future, funding window open to us, and I think this is, well, it's part of the NEST program, I guess, but to come up with the strategy along with all of the people involved to say, well, this is what we need to do. We've got a plan for what happens when there's an outbreak level, and we just need to make explicit what has to be done at the pre-outbreak level and in a continuous kind of context, and try and get that, in black and white, and so everyone knows. And there's a mechanism that will be triggered, and people will act on it. I think that just hasn't been clear enough in the past.
I think one of the issues, and this falls to the science community in one part. Science obviously is a tool to society. Society is now saying, and industry are now saying, they want to see the control of Crown of Thorns. But for that to happen, for that to happen though, science now as a collective has to be very clear in its messaging. Obfuscating, pushing your own agenda, not saying clearly what progress is being made, where the gains are occurring on the ground and where they're not, is an inherent problem, particularly around the marine science agenda. And everyone's really out there carting for themselves and not actually pushing in a collective direction forward. I think we've seen a change around the Crown of Thorns program more recently, but it is clear statements. And not always what we don't know, but what we do know. And not always what we have to do in the future, but what success we've had and how we drive that into the future. It is a different language. It's speaking in the assertive voice rather than the passive voice. And I'm not sure we're very comfortable with doing that, but if we don't do it, I can tell you funding will dry up real quick. So it's that clear, directive statements about what we know, how we go forward. Because every science conference you go to, everyone stands up and tells you what they don't know. And you get to a point and say, well, why are we funding you if you completely don't know shit? At some point, you have to start knowing and moving forward. It's a hard lesson to learn when that's not your training, but it's really somewhere where we need to go.
So we have to be brave and we have to be clear. So thank you. I think that's a good point for us to stop. It is lunchtime.